standpoint of Putin, once he gets into Ukraine, what he thought was a problem is infinitely greater. Once they get into eastern Ukraine, not only do they find this monstrous Ukrainian army for which he was unprepared, he also finds the biolab.
But is the intelligence on both sides failing at the time?
Yeah, I think so. I think both sides misinterpreted and misread things. No question about it. I think there are two things that have to be taken into account because I've seen it happen here. It may be that President Putin received different kinds of intelligence assessments, and he picked and chose what he thought was appropriate. I have to take that into consideration.
Kind of wishful thinking.
We now call them standard missiles, but they're very, very powerful and very quick, that those would show up in eastern Ukraine. And that would place them within minutes of striking the Russian nuclear deterrent and destroy their early warning system and so forth. That's what he was worried about. But when he gets in there, he finds out this Ukrainian army is actually exceptionally good. It's not perfect, but it's damn good. And they have to make a decision after about several months, what are we going to do? And remember, they tried in Istanbul, and they thought they had an agreement because the keystone in the agreement was neutrality for Ukraine. And at that point, he was ready to back out of Ukraine. And that brings up something else that's interesting. When the Russian forces first entered eastern Ukraine, they encountered lots of Russians. Obviously, the people there were Russian. And they said, well, thank God you've come. And then the people said, well, what are you going to do? Well, we're just here to, push the Ukrainians back and then get a deal, and then we'll leave. And the Russian people there said, if you're going to leave, then the Ukrainian secret police will come back and put bullets in all of our heads. So many of them said, the hell with you. We're not going to support you. If you're not here to liberate us and protect us,
you're not here to stay.
Go home, you know. Literally, these conversations were held. This was reported back to Putin. This is where Putin begins to realize he's dealing with a different animal from what he initially thought. And what he was looking for was something on the Austrian model. Because just as once Austria became neutral and the Russian forces left, there was still a Russian representative on the Austrian Defense Council for many years. And his job was to make sure the Austrians actually carried out, to the fullness of the law, what they'd agreed to. And that's what Putin wanted in Kiev. I want a Russian on the National Defense Council so that they can monitor that you're genuinely neutral.
But the interesting thing, of course, is how it's going to develop itself, because it became something different.
Well, that's right. The great lesson of margin of victory is that whatever you anticipated doesn't turn out to be the case. So if you think you're moving in for a brief period of time, or this is going to be a short war, you've probably made a serious mistake. So before you start anything, you need to stand back and look at all the possibilities.
Do you think at the time that Putin was aware that in fact he was fighting a war against the West?
No, that's the problem. He thought we were approachable. He thought the people, especially in Berlin, he was shocked when Scholz shows up and spews this nonsense. It was a case of cognitive dissonance, as we say in English. He couldn't reconcile what the man was saying with reality. He said, Scholz has joined this. Berlin is now in this camp that is violently anti-Russian. And we have no reason for the Germans to hate us. We've gotten along with the Germans. It's just sort of, what is going on? He couldn't believe it. I think the problem there has always been his association with the KGB. The assumption is that he's another NKVD thug like Yagoda in Ukraine. And that was absolutely not the case. The other thing is, and I had time when I was in graduate school to meet with defectors, many of whom were KGB agents or GRU people. And what you found from them was that they had traveled extensively outside of the Soviet Union. They knew more about the West and had a very different view.
So they broadened their mind.
And that was the case with Putin. He had lived outside the country. He'd gotten to know Germany very well, liked the Germans, got along with the Germans. And he began to see the West as a potential partner. Remember, he raised the issue of could Russia join NATO?
Was this a serious proposal?
I think it was very serious on his part. I think he was looking for an opportunity to integrate Russia into the West. But he's always had people around him saying, Vladimir, you don't understand. They hate us. It doesn't matter what you do. And it's always interesting to me that people are so anxious to attack Putin when he is probably the best possible representative of Western interests in Moscow of anybody that exists. Everyone else was completely unsurprised by what we did. They have no idea what they're talking about, but that's not new. We never understood Vietnam. We intervened in a civil war. We murdered the only man, we assassinated the only man that could hold the country together. His name was Diem. We created catastrophe. In Afghanistan, after we'd gone in, the one man that everyone was willing to live with in Afghanistan was the king, because he ran what we would call a confederation, where these were regional interests and so forth. What did we do? We removed him and put in a CIA agent named Karzai. And of course, then the corruption became unstoppable. We go into Iraq, and what do? We don't understand what we are doing. America blunders in like an elephant and crushes everything under its feet, and then says, "Aren't you happy I'm here? Aren't you grateful that I've come? I'm the big elephant that's going to deliver everything you want." Well, I think what was happening for Putin is that he starts this thing and he suddenly realizes the elephant is the enemy, not the friend. And then by June, his generals sit down with him and they said, "Look, if you're serious about this, we're going to have to change everything. We're going to have to be prepared to fight for years. This is a large war of decision." And that's when he realizes this is an existential threat to Russia. This is not something we are prepared under any circumstances to lose. Now, he never thought that was possible anyway, because very prudently he said, strategically, you want to fight me on my doorstep? You're pretty stupid. And he was right. But he grossly miscalculated initially. He thought he was dealing with a different set of leaders from what it was actually there. And then he decides to change everything. By the time you get to the fall, he appoints new leadership, and the Russian Air Force general who took over command effectively in the East builds this defensive thing and says, "Look, we can't hold everything because we don't have enough forces. You're going to have to withdraw over here from Kharkov." The Ukrainians said, "Oh, look,
Zaluzhny, this is the defense line he built in Ukraine."
But then what's his name? I'm talking about the Russians, what the Russians built once they had established themselves in eastern Ukraine and the Russian-speaking areas. To the north, they were very close to Kharkov, but it was very lightly defended. They only had 2,000 men up there. And the Ukrainians were told by us, because we began providing them with satellite intelligence.
How's this line called?
Well, it's just south of Kharkov. And it was just a plain right up to the river on the border with Russia. And we said, go ahead and attack that. And the commander said to President Putin, let him have it. It doesn't matter right now. We need to consolidate our position. Then we need to become impregnable. And when we've consolidated our position, our defenses are impregnable, then we launch offensives and we move out of them. Effectively, a repetition of Kursk from the Russian standpoint. And the Ukrainians were then invited to do what? Attack. And we were stupid enough to tell them to attack. And what the Russians have proven and demonstrated, something they understood since the 70s, was the criticality of linking all of the overhead, space-based and terrestrial surveillance, unmanned and manned, drones, satellites, everything, with all of the standoff attack systems, rocket artillery, conventional artillery, tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, everything.
Let's get into that.
And when that was linked, then we didn't seem to appreciate the lethality of that system. I call it in my book, Margin of Victory, and previously in my previous book in 2003, Transformation Under Fire, I call it the ISR strike complex. And I said we have to integrate ground forces, maneuver, and logistics within this larger ISR strike complex. We have to go all the way back to Ogarkov in the night.
That's the ISR is intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance.
And he talked about the recon strike platform in space that will allow them to target and destroy anything on the planet. Of course, they didn't have the technology. And so this was conceptual, but he was right. Well, first of all, we have to keep in mind that
were all the production plans of the 80s? What did they do?
The plans. I mean, there are lots of plans on the shelf that were never thrown away. One of the things that the Russians don't do is throw things away.
That's what I mean.
They keep everything.
The plans.
But it wasn't just plans. You had to have the factories there. The manufacturing base had to exist. It was there. It just hadn't been mobilized and utilized. And at the same time, the Russians were always very good, and I think the Germans were, but not as good as the Russians during the Second War, of taking lessons from the field back to the scientists and the engineers. And they would come up front and look at what was happening, and they would make the changes that were necessary to improve the system, weapons platform. The other thing is that organizationally, the force that came into Ukraine is different from the force you had today. They made prudent changes, and they changed their chain of command. We have the same structure in NATO that we had in 1944-45, with all these echelons of command and control. Slows down the decision-making process. It's very hard to maneuver and manipulate. One of the things I pointed out in the book was that Eisenhower, as Supreme Commander, had to fight with U.S. and British Air Force officers to get them to bomb certain things that were vital to the success of the Normandy invasion. Because their attitude was, it doesn't matter what you do, we're winning the war by flattening Germany.
That is one of the main points also in your book, also at the end, in the conclusion, in which you say, well, there has to be a unity of command.
And you see on the Russian side, and when I covered the battle, the destruction of Army Group Center in June and July of 1944, even though the real numbers that I found were interesting because they destroyed far fewer Germans than we thought, and the Germans managed to do far greater damage to the Soviets than was reported. And the funny thing was that I discovered that the Germans had sent over 100,000 men on leave because they knew exactly where the Russians were coming. They were, oh, this Maskarova, forget it. It didn't work. The German soldiers in the field and the commanders in the field knew exactly what was coming, and Hitler refused to change dispositions. So they said, well, what's the point of losing, hundreds of thousands? So they sent 100,000 on leave. So on the day of the attack, there are 110,000 German soldiers facing 1 million. That's it. So, but that's aside from the point. But what you have with Zhukov, for instance, who's the overall commander of these fronts, he is able to summon 5,000 Soviet aircraft in the space of 15 minutes and hurl them at a concentration of German troops, which was enormously effective, success. Yes, now they are.
So the different services are...
Oh, yes. They are absolutely integrated, and they are responsive. There is one man at every level who commands everything.
Commands everything.
Yeah, in other words, it's your level, whatever it is. Yeah. It may be 15,000, 20,000, 80,000, whatever it turns out to be. He commands everything, all the air forces. And here's a good example. Well, I think it's a question in the Russian case. First of all, historically, unity of command is something the Russians have always practiced.
Okay.
If the man who's the supreme commander says do it, everybody does it. We have no history of that. That was true under the Tsars. Now, his generals were often not the best. Well, there were also Soviet generals that weren't very good. There were some generals that were initially out there with the forces that went into Ukraine, as well as colonels and others. They're gone. They were removed. And you talk about democracy. There was an incident involving infantry. These were paratroopers that had been placed under the command of a brigade commander.
When was that?
This would have been the fall of 2022.
Okay.
They attacked and they took terrible losses.
Yeah.
And the paratroopers came back and they sat down and wrote a letter. They gave it to newspaper journalists, and they explained why they'd failed in this attack, because all of the measures that should have been taken were not, and the man who was in command was at fault. That was brought to Putin's attention. Putin went to the front, removed him. And that's been going on over there. Now, some Russians would complain and say they haven't removed enough. I've heard Russians say that. But the truth is, Putin has done those things, and you now have a force that has very few weak links. It's similar to the quality of the German force that invaded Russia. After Poland and the Low Countries, all the weak, mediocre officers were gone. They were removed. And the best people were in the right jobs. That's what Putin now has in his force in Ukraine. But to go back to this instantaneous link, I went in and received a presentation from some people that I cannot name, but they're here in the United States, and they showed me where there was a request to launch a cruise missile at a building, and this was in, let's just say, north central Ukraine, in a city, because the Ukrainians had placed crew-served weapons, that is, missiles and artillery into this building. They couldn't get at it from the ground. They couldn't strike it effectively. And so within 10 minutes, a cruise missile was launched from the Black Sea Fleet of effort, and also commonality of communications and understanding. People understand across these service lines. We don't have that. We do sometimes at the lowest level, because the people down there who are doing the fighting, they have to do that. It's this upper levels where you have the problem. For many, many years, there was an old phrase, give the unit artillery and you've made the unit independent. In other words, if you had an infantry or cavalry force in the old days and you provided them with artillery, they could now go out and operate on their own, because as long as they were supplied with artillery, they could prepare the battlefield, attack targets, and then envelop or flank or whatever. Today, you give them unmanned systems at the lowest level, you've made them independent, because that unmanned system can provide instantaneous information. Let's say you are an infantry squad, maybe you have some armor with you. You can now see kilometers in front of you. You have a picture of everything right away. Now, some of that will come from above, but most of it's your own. You can now act on your own information immediately, because it's not just surveillance. You have to be able to act on it. We have this thing we call intelligence. Well, intelligence is information that's being analyzed and refined, but that takes time. So the first comes surveillance. That gives you the information. But at different levels, people can act on that and make it intelligence before it reaches the top. And we've done everything we can at our level, and we can't fix the problem. Therefore, it goes up to be fixed. Someone at the next level who is a targeteer, someone who targets, matches weapons against targets, says, good, we got a cruise missile ready to go. And it goes instantly. For us, before anything can happen, it all has to be approved at multiple levels.
But that's the way that this Russian colonel can deal with it.
Yes, absolutely. A lieutenant colonel can deal with it. Captains can deal with it. I watched video of a Russian tank commander from a Russian tank platoon, and he's directing an entire battle that involves rocket artillery, conventional artillery rounds, some infantry on his flanks against a Ukrainian element that is just being annihilated, decimated.
It's fascinating, because it's a kind of a decentralization.
Yes. But you've got to prepare for that, because you want to be decentralized. You don't see massive concentrations of Russian forces on a narrow front the way you did 80 years ago, because that's a target. You want to be dispersed. You want to concentrate your fire and then briefly exploit it by concentrating some of your force, but then go back to dispersion as a matter of protection. And then you have to build in your own integrated air defense. We have no integrated air defenses in NATO. Right now, we can protect 5% of NATO territory from air and missile attack. Think about that. And people talk about going to war with Russia. They're idiots.
What does that mean, having an integrated air defense?
That means that you have different kinds of air defense weapons at every level. You'll have the shoulder fired.
You bring it along with you.
And it all moves with you. And you'll see as the Russians move, they will halt at a certain range, because they don't want to get out from under the integrated air defense umbrella. Because if they get out from under that, if they outpace it, then they can be detected and struck dramatically.
And they learned at a very high pace.
For instance, they've gotten to fight with brigades. But in contrast to us, we'll have a brigade of, say, 5,000, maybe less, maybe more, and we'll fight that unit. What the Russians do is that they have the brigade headquarters, and they always have 5 battalions at their disposal, on average, 4 or 5, but they rotate them. Okay, it's been 48 hours, this battalion goes back for rest, another battalion comes in and takes its place. So they are very sensitive to the impact of close combat on their own troops. They never,
mentally and physically.
yeah, they never cared in the past, because I know history very well.
Yeah.
And even great commanders.
But fighting the Germans, they were just
Oh,
throwing
yeah,
in
yeah.
there.
Oh, they took at least twice the losses that they admit publicly. When I was in Moscow in November 2001, and I was there, I was still on active duty then, and I was there as a delegation, and we went to the Russian General Staff College, and we met with the Russian General Staff. And they told me, I asked point blank, I said, what about the losses during the Second World War? We all know that, the official losses are inaccurate. They said, oh, that's true. And so I asked, what is the right answer? And they said two things. They said, in the NKVD archives, this is the secret police archives, we've been counting the losses. We're up to 39,900,000. Now remember that Stalin executed 1 million soldiers in the Soviet army for refusing to fight the Germans. Very few people know that. The Germans executed 23,000 soldiers in the whole war for failing to obey orders under fire. Think about the difference in the two. Stalin's army was a slave army. People were driven like slaves into gunfire. At the same time, they said, take whatever figures are there, the official Soviet figures, and multiply them by a factor of 2 or at least 1.5. And then you'll have a better picture of the losses of just soldiers, which they estimated to be 15, 16 million. Yeah, but what happened was that MI6, the CIA, working with the Ukrainians, dusted off all of this nonsense, all this business from the Second World War, and repurposed it and sent it out, saying, well, this is the same thing as you've seen in the past. My sources are a combination of things. I've had to depend heavily on friends in Europe that I've known for years, and some of those are actually on the other side, as well as in Ukraine. For instance, there's one, I shouldn't even say it, but I will, one Pole who has grandparents who are Ukrainian and relatives that are in a position to talk. And they give a very different picture of what's happening. I mean, today, the picture that is emerging is that all the Ukrainian people just desperately want an end to this. You now have Ukrainians who are saying, for God's sakes, let the Russians come and put an end to this, insanity. You have Ukrainian soldiers being interviewed that you can watch on Telegram saying,
Yes, I know.
we should go with them and kill this Zelensky and this crew.
But how many casualties are we?
On the Ukrainian side, I'm reliably told that it's now probably 600,000 Ukrainian dead soldiers, over 1 million casualties. And remember that they haven't had the effective medical evacuation and treatment that exists on the Russian side. The Russians have had probably 50,000 dead, although some claim less, some claim more. I would certainly say 50,000. You might come up with numbers for 55 to 60,000, particularly if you look at the Donetsk and Luhansk militias and perhaps Kadyrov's Chechen forces. It might go to 60, 63,000. But
that's one of the story.
But we're the ones, we in the West, that have been urging them to go forward. If you go and look at some of these television generals on the U.S. side, as I call them, people like Petraeus and Keane and others, and they say, oh, I think the Ukrainians are really super prepared for this. They're well-trained. They have just the right equipment. I know they're going to break through these defenses. And then they try to talk about how to break through the defenses. They don't know what they're talking about. Because the Russians have built defenses in depth that are linked to all the surveillance. The Ukrainian...
They didn't even reach the lines.
And the Ukrainians say, as soon as I stick my head out of the foxhole, I'm under attack. There's a drone up there. So it's a layered operation terrestrially as well as in space. In other words, you've got it at every level. And again, it's not enough to see it. You have to be able to attack. And the Russians have mastered the links. And one of the reasons for that is that Putin says, if I cross the river right now, which he could easily do that, they'll say, see, he wants to conquer Eastern Europe. And he says, we've never been interested in that. We have no interest in that. That's not what we want.
No, but there's a big chance he's going for Odessa, isn't it?
Odessa's historically... And what I see happening right now is this forces up near Kharkov are acting like a magnet for the Ukrainians. They're pulling forces from other places and putting them there because,
So there's weakening them in the south.
Yeah, and they said the Russians are going for Kiev, which they may yet do before this is over. But right now, that's not the goal. The goal is to get the Ukrainian forces up there for two reasons. Number one, you're weakening the south, which makes it much easier to cross down there and seize Odessa. And secondly, you're killing what's left that can fight. Vast numbers of units have simply refused to attack. And I don't blame them. Why would you do it? I mean, the French army rebelled in 1917. They were tired of dying. In other words, they're committing suicide.
Yeah, that's exactly. It's a suicidal war.
Yeah, and Zorovikin invited them to do it. And that's where they've taken most of their losses against his defense, just as the Germans were stupid and took the bait at Kursk. There were big debates. The Russian deputy chief of staff of the Russian general staff, and I covered this in the book, he was a tremendous Russian patriot. His father had been a colonel in the Tsar's army. And he planned Kursk in great detail. He set up defenses. And he went in to see Stalin, and he had on one side Zhukov, and I think on the other Sokolovsky, or I can't remember. The book covers this. And I found it fascinating because Stalin, of course, was just like Hitler. Attack, attack, attack. And the deputy chief of staff said something to Stalin that no one ever said. No, sir. He said, what? We can't win this war without attacking. He said, no, sir, we will lose the war if we attack, because at that point in 43, what could the Germans do brilliantly? Maneuver. That's something the Russians still hadn't learned yet. He said, no. He said, this is my plan. And he described it and said, the Germans can't resist attacking this. Let them expend themselves on this impregnable Kursk salient. And once they've expended themselves, then we can go on the offensive. And Stalin got up and walked around and wasn't happy. And the two generals, marshals, were shaking. They were so concerned, so I'm told. And he came back and said, all right, but you know what this means. And everybody did. If this fails, you'll be shot. It worked. Yeah. And Zorovikin is not dealing with Stalin. Zorovikin made it work. Now, he was then shipped out for other kinds of reasons because of turmoil. Remember, this man who died in a plane crash, I can't remember his name, Prigozhin. Oh, yeah, Prigozhin. Yeah, when Prigozhin talked about what he thought was wrong in the high command of the Russian military, he was not wrong. He was very critical of a lot of things. But it was not the sort of thing one should do publicly. And certainly you don't lead some sort of crusade back to Moscow to see the Tsar. That's outrageous, which is effectively what he did. But Putin acted and did remove people and change things. And you had, just very recently, you had more people removed. You had 3 general officers in various positions and one on the deputy chief of the general staff for logistics, all on corruption charges. You know, a lot of people don't understand how much time both Putin and Xi spend on corruption. It's a problem. So they've cleaned a lot up, and the Russian army now is probably better than it's been, certainly in 50, 60 years. Maybe better than it ever was. We don't know. But the point is that it's an existential war for Russia. They understand that now. The West is out to destroy them. They listened to Biden say that in March in Poland, that Putin is evil, we have to have regime change. And when Biden was asked, his handlers, I guess, had given him this answer, he says there can be no agreement on the current lines. There is no compromise with evil. You know, is this foolish ideology? Everyone who disagrees with us is evil and must die. This is sort of stupidity in Washington, D.C. Well, Paul Kennedy, in his book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, talks about a lot of these issues, that what brings down great powers. Most of it is internal and suicidal as opposed to any great failure in war. And the United States, in particular, in the aftermath of 1991's Desert Storm, was intoxicated with its sense of absolute supremacy. Now, when I say the United States, I'm talking about people in Washington. The average American was just happy that we were successful. A lot of people took the position we've now erased the stain on our honor from Vietnam. You know, we put this behind us. We're back on a good track now. And unfortunately, everybody talked about what they said was a benefit of downsizing the military, that we would have this big capital gain that would allow us to devote ourselves to other things and so forth. Well, it really didn't happen. We came to certain wrong conclusions. We faced an adversary who was formidable on paper, but really wasn't as capable as a Russian or a Turkish or a Japanese or Chinese enemy. We became full of ourselves, and we decided that whatever we'd done was right. And instead of looking at this as an opportunity to make profound change in new directions, we kept everything as it was. We just downsized the militaries so they became antiquated versions of what we think won the war, which was, after all, another manifestation of a World War II style force structure. So militarily, it was stagnation after that. We spent a lot of money because we were enamored of push-button success. We began to think of wars, once again, not reflecting on the flesh and blood, the human dimension, but we began thinking in terms of, well, how much money do we need to buy the new missile? The new missile is our new wonder weapon, delivered by the Air Force or the Navy or something else. And there were very few of us that actually saw action against an enemy that fought back. In many cases, the enemy just gave up and walked. This led to certain false assumptions. First of all, they forgot the human dimension to combat. They didn't understand what had happened and whom they'd fought. This probably had more in common with the wars that the British and the French fought in their colonies before World War I. And of course, they were very pleased with themselves. And they were so pleased with themselves that they began to fantasize that they could take on the Germans. And of course, the Imperial German Army was very different from the Sudanese tribesmen, the Zulus, or the Pashtun tribesmen up in northwest India, or the Berbers and the Rifts, and so forth. Big mistake. And we know how that turned out. Millions of people died. It was a disaster. And once again, we intervened. And as a result, the French and the British came out of it with their empires, which is all they cared about in the final analysis, but it didn't achieve much. 1991 was another great achievement, but instead of saying, look, that's good, that's fine, we don't need to meddle in the rest of the world. We just need to do business with the rest of the world, which is the traditional American viewpoint. After World War I and even after World War II, we dramatically downsized our militaries, and we were trying to pursue good relations with everybody. We discovered that we'd actually not won the Second World War that Stalin had, and now we had a tremendous adversary or opponent in communism. Well, after 1991, there was no such thing. There was nobody out there. And that led us to the false assumption that we could do anything, anywhere, anytime that we wanted to. And you have this famous memorandum penned in the Pentagon by Paul Wolfowitz, who at the time was, I guess, the Undersecretary for Policy and Strategy, something like that. And it simply said this: we're the boss. There's nobody who can...
It was the famous unipolar moment.
Yeah. And we can use our military as we see fit, and we can rectify everything. And of course, he was focused on...
like Athens in the Mediterranean at the time.
Exactly. We forgot, though, we're preeminently what? A maritime power. We're not a continental power. There's a big difference.